Welcome to Mission Drift, a series for faith-driven entrepreneur. My name is Allison Long-Patine, and I've been investing in startups and entrepreneurs for over a decade with a variety of funds where I've been both a founder or partner. Having worked with a multitude of founders, I know that they are necessarily missional people, and faith-driven entrepreneurs particularly have a clear call and larger purpose to their work. But one of the great challenges of any organization is staying true to their mission in the midst of natural growing pains and changes. That's why we're excited to have Peter Greer guide us in this series. Peter is an award-winning author of numerous volumes, including Entrepreneurship for Human Flourishing, Rooting for Rivals, and The Gift of Disillusionment. Over the next 2 episodes, he's going to be unpacking the concepts from his book, Mission Drift. In this talk, he introduces us to the dangers of veering just a little off course and gives us a framework for how we avoid the tiny compromises that lead to major shifts. Let's watch.
Several years ago, I was meeting with a foundation in Houston, Texas, and at the end of the presentation, they said, "Peter, we love the work that you're doing around the world. We love the approach to poverty alleviation." But then they said this, they said, "You keep talking about your faith. You keep talking about Jesus." They said, "Because we're a publicly traded company, downplay that, stop talking about that, and then we'll be able to partner with you." And I can tell you, in that moment, I wanted so desperately to find a way to figure out the partnership with them. But I look back at that moment and I say that was the biggest gift that I have ever been given in my leadership journey. And it was not because they granted the money, they end up not granting us the money, but it was because I realized perhaps for the first time that I was willing to compromise on our core mission. As we took a step back, we realized we could not compromise on our mission. We said no to the funding, but we said yes to a conversation about how we remain mission true. That conversation stayed with us, and we started doing research about how do we make sure that we don't drift from our core mission? How do we make sure that we stay mission true? And so we started looking at organizations that had scaled and professionalized, and we found something shocking. We found that mission drift is all around us, and it's in some crazy places that you never would have guessed. One of the examples is when we found the story behind pawn shops. Pawn shops, I don't know about you, but when I drive by a pawn shop, I do not think that is an amazing group of individuals on the front line of poverty alleviation. And yet when you look at the history, that is exactly what they were created to be. They were created by the Franciscans as a way to care for individuals in need. They actually took on St. Nicholas as their patron saint. And even if you look at the logo of pawn shops, some think that that ties to the 3 purses in the story of St. Nicholas. This was a way that the church was caring for those in need. I would say that today, they have not only lost their mission, but have gone to such an extent that they prey on the very people that they were created to serve. But we can look at the story of pawn shops and we can look at them because of the perspective that we have. That did not happen over one day. It did not happen over one decade. It happened slowly. And the challenge with Mission Drift is it happens slowly and it happens one small compromise at a time. As we looked at the story of Mission Drift, we started looking in the mirror and saying, not if, but where might we be compromising as well? So the question is, what is it that causes organizations to drift from the mission? And how can we make sure that is not our story? We started having conversations with individuals that had stayed mission true. We started having conversations across a variety of sectors to try to identify what is it that keeps an organization on mission? And the first thing that we heard again and again and again was that individuals believed that drift could happen to them. As we had conversations with these mission true organizations, the conversation was not new. They could point to other examples in their sector or in their life, and they could say, this is where we saw drift happening, and we are committed to that not being our story. And if you're not yet convinced on that, there are so many incredible examples. But did you know that the founding mission statement of Harvard University is this: to be plainly instructed and consider well that the main end of your life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ. They were created to be an institution not just of higher education, but to point individuals to Jesus. But even 100 years after the founding of Harvard University, there was a group of individuals that saw that drift was occurring. And so they moved south, they moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and they said, we need to create an alternative to Harvard University that will not drift, that will stay true to that mission. And they created Yale University. And while Harvard's motto was Veritas, truth, they said, we need to make sure that we look at lux et veritas, light and truth. And yet what happened to Harvard happened to Yale and happens all around the world. There's another interesting example that happened in the nonprofit space. But an organization was founded by Dr. J. Calvin Clark. He was a Presbyterian minister who went to Asia, he went to China, and he was asked a question by a friend after that trip. And the question was this: do you believe that Americans are doing all they can to help? And his answer to that question was no, there's more that we can do. And he founded an organization to reach individuals with the love of Jesus Christ and was a pioneer in the child sponsorship movement. There's another organization that was founded just a few years later, 1952, but it was a very similar story. It also was founded by a minister, a Presbyterian minister, who also took a trip to Asia. He went to Korea, was also asked a question by a friend. And the question was this: you've seen the tremendous needs and unparalleled opportunities of this land. What do you intend to do about it? And he also started an organization that uses child sponsorship to reach individuals with the love of Jesus Christ. These stories almost sound interchangeable. They sound very similar. And yet with the gift of perspective, the gift of time, we can realize that two stories that started with very similar circumstances are not at the same place today. The first organization is now known as Child Fund. It was also known as Christian Children's Fund. And a few years ago, in 2009, when they changed their name, a board member said this. The board member said, this organization has nothing to do with Christianity. But I can just imagine the founder, I can just imagine those. What do you mean it has nothing to do with Christianity? This was at the core of who we are. This is the core of why we created Christian Children's Fund. And then the contrasting story, though, the other organization is a story of Compassion International. And a few years ago, Compassion was asked if they would be willing to drop in Jesus' name from the way that they talked about their organization. And Wes Stafford said this. He said, we thought for 10 seconds and said, no, not now, not ever. That is a mission true leader. That is someone who knows that his mission is not for sale. His mission matters most. We see this across organizations. We see this in higher education, and we also see this as a story that is woven in the pages of Scripture. There is a bold declaration that Joshua made, and this declaration that Joshua says, he says, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. He knows that going into the land, there's going to be a tendency to drift, to forget the amazing, miraculous rescue that he had experienced. And he says, no, not just for me and my household, we are going to stay true to the Lord. But the question is, how well did his household do? And in my Bible, the answer is one page. You turn one page to the book of Judges, and in the opening chapters, we read this. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. Joshua's ancestors, Joshua's descendants, Joshua's grandchildren drifted. They forgot the bold declaration that Joshua had made. And what we see in the example from Joshua is the example that we see today time and time again, that the passions of the first generation become the preferences of the second generation and become irrelevant to the third. So how do we make sure that is not our story? If we believe that drift happens, that is the right starting point, but it is not the right ending point. And we're going to turn next to some practical steps that we can take to make sure that we stay mission true.
World War II fighter planes had very specific missions. Some would have to fly to tiny islands in the Pacific with very specific routes. These stops would often be places to refuel because the full destination was too far for the small engines to handle. If the pilot veered from the route ever so slightly, they could end up running out of gas in the middle of the ocean. Like those pilots, entrepreneurs can find themselves accidentally drifting from their intended destination because of seemingly small changes they made along the way. Like Peter said, Mission drift happens slowly, as one compromise piles onto another. The same is true in the other direction, though. Staying true to a mission requires a bunch of small commitments, day in and day out, to remain on course, to commit to the path you've been called to. And in the moments when you do start to veer, quickly returning to the path you started on, heading in the direction God has for you. How are you fighting against mission drift? Are there areas where you've seen it creep in already? If so, how can you pilot your organization back to the right route? Talk about these things in your group and how it relates to the journey you're on. Open yourselves up to learning from one another. Be transparent and honest with each other. What you get out of this time together will only be as enriching and life-giving as what you put in. See you next time.